It started with a Monday and a Merlot. Wolfe had barely finished decimating a roast squaw with mustard greens when Fritz opened the door to a man who smelled like vinegar and looked like someone had replaced his bloodstream with Pinot Noir. He wore a tweed jacket that probably predated Prohibition and shoes that didn't. I clocked him for a wine critic before he even made it past the threshold. He had that anxious, acidic air that floats around guys who spend their life telling other people what not to drink. "I need Mr. Wolfe," he said to Fritz, and then to me when I emerged from the dining room. "Urgently. It's about a cellar, a theft, a betrayal." That last word had a tremor on it, like it was less about wine and more about people. I gave him my standard tour guide smile. "Mr. Wolfe doesn't drink wine, finds it uncivilized, but you're welcome to disturb his digestion if you think your theft outweighs his distaste for interruptions." He gave me a narrowed eye like I was something floating in a bottle, but followed me anyway. Wolfe was just settling back into the chair in the office, yes, that chair, the throne from which he ruled the kingdom of rational thought and perpetual grumpiness. "This is Mr. Nigel Poirot," I said. "He comes bearing grapes and grievances." Wolfe didn't look up. "Archie? If this is another connoisseur trying to evangelize for Syrah—" "I'm not a connoisseur," Poirot cut in. "I'm a documentarian. I make archival wine records for estates and private collectors. Think of me as a librarian for bottles." Wolfe allowed his eyes to shift upward. "And someone has stolen your overdue volumes." Poirot sat down, uninvited, which was either gutsy or suicidal. "A week ago, I was cataloguing the vintage stock at the Mulliner estate. They've got a private collection nothing short of legendary, 100-year-old ports, forgotten French imports, even a Chilean varietal from a vineyard that burned down in the 40s. Fascinating," Wolfe said in a tone that meant less than fascinating. "What is the alleged crime?" I created a private, coded file listing the inventory. It included more than wine. There were annotations, personal notes, legal concerns, some involving the Mulliner family, scandal sauce. I muttered, taking a seat. Poirot shot me a sour glance, but pushed on. "That file is missing. I didn't misplace it. I encrypted it, stored it in my satchel, and left it overnight in the Mulliner wine cellar. When I returned it was gone. No broken lock, no sign of entry, just vanished." Wolfe sniffed, which with him could mean many things. "Disgust, interest, both. And what precisely does this have to do with me?" "I believe someone in the family stole it, either to suppress what I found or to use it. I need you to find out who." Wolfe's eyelids performed their trademark half-lift. "You expect me to wade into a dispute over a file among wine-fattened dilettantes?" Poirot leaned forward. "This file contains proof of financial tampering, hidden inheritances, and maybe even fraud. It's more than a list, it's leverage. And if it's in the wrong hands, someone could be ruined." I piped up, "Or worse, come looking to ruin you." "Exactly," Poirot said. "I've already received an anonymous note. No signature, no demand. Just a quote. Even wine turns to vinegar in the wrong bottle. That's not coincidence." Wolfe took a long breath. His stomach currently hosting the aforementioned squaw. Probably wanted him to ignore this, but he didn't, Archie. Sir, bring me the details, names, inhabitants, employees, a layout of this cellar, and any logs regarding entry or removal. Also, speak to the family and inquire casually about their opinion of Mr. Poirot's professional rigor. I blinked. You're taking the case? No. Wolfe closed his eyes. I am preparing to reject it intelligently. Poirot's lips twisted. Then what would it take for you to accept it? Wolfe opened one eye. Bring me a bottle of that Chilean varietal. The one that no longer exists, if you can produce. The impossible. I shall entertain your improbable case. Poirot stood. You'll have it by tomorrow. I'll call ahead. He left with the speed of someone who felt both relieved and outmaneuvered. Wolfe didn't move. Didn't have to. I said, You believe him? No. Wolfe muttered. But he reeks of something beyond grapes. Something I can't identify. Danger. Duplicity. Wolfe closed his eyes. Find out who stands to gain from this file. And Archie, don't get distracted by their vintages. Understood, I said. But if anyone offers me a glass, I won't insult their hospitality. Wolfe snorted. Then have Fritz pack you an antacid. The brownstone had been disturbed. Not loud, not violent. Just a quiet fermentation of lies, starting to bubble. The next morning, I took a cab down to the Mulliner estate for stories of sandstone stubbornness. Perched along the Hudson, just far enough from Manhattan to pretend it was above it all, and just close enough to crawl back in when the parties needed press coverage. I'd called ahead. But it turned out my rival was neither expected nor appreciated. A woman with a face like refrigerated silverware met me at the door and introduced herself as Mrs. Adeline Mulliner, widow, matriarch, gatekeeper. She shook my hand like she was testing it for cracks. I suppose Mr. Wolfe couldn't be bothered to come himself, she said, ushering me into a foyer the size of a midtown jazz club. He could be, I said cheerfully, but then the cosmos would tilt and birds would fall out of the sky. She didn't smile, not even a courtesy to which I explained my reason for being their Mr. Poirot's missing file, Wolfe's interest, and my need to speak with anyone who might have had access to the cellar or a motive to swipe a satchel full of secrets. That got her moving, though it felt more like leading a tour through a porcelain museum than welcoming an investigator. She brought me to a sunroom that looked like it hadn't seen real sun since the Taft administration, and began listing the residents of the house with the enthusiasm of someone forced to recite their taxes. There's my stepson, Howard, his wife, Lillian, my daughter-in-law Cecily, though she refuses the title. Then there's my late husband's brother, Everett, who continues to live here like a squatter. And finally, our house manager, Gerda Lemke, and her son, Otto, who maintains the grounds. I jotted them down. 5 suspects and a butler. Wolfe would be delighted. I assume you've spoken with Mr. Poirot about his accusations, I said. Her nostrils flared. I spoke with him after he accused me of harboring a thief. Yes, he came here under contract to record wine bottles, not family secrets. But the file contained both, which is precisely the problem. She folded her arms. If Poirot had found something damaging, he should have taken it to me directly. Instead, he scribbled it into a private file and tucked it away like a hostage. I don't respond well to ransom notes, Mr. Goodwin. That was good to know. So was the fact that she didn't deny the existence of secrets just how they were handled. May I speak with the others? She gave me a look usually reserved for dog stains. They're all aware of the situation. Whether they cooperate is another matter, which meant they wouldn't. Not without leverage, bait, or Wolfe's special brand of verbal judo. I asked to see the wine cellar, and she took me, herself, down to flights of stairs, through a locked door, past another locked gate, and into what I can only describe as the Vatican of booze. Ceiling arches, brick walls, racks arranged like confessionals, bottles stored with the reverence of holy relics. This is where Poirot worked. I asked. Double quotes, yes. Alone, the file was reportedly stored in that cabinet. She pointed to a walnut thing with brass hinges, and the door was locked overnight. Yes, only I and Gerda Lemke have keys. Anyone else know the code or have access? No, she said, a little too quickly. I took a look around, opened the cabinet, and confirmed it was empty except for dust and one corkscrew that looked like it hadn't been used since Eisenhower. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks. If the file had walked, it had done so with someone carrying a key and a motive. Back upstairs, I met Howard in the billiards room. He was a smooth-cheeked, smooth-voiced finance guy whose idea of casual wear was an ascot, and whose handshake was like holding a folded napkin. When I brought up Poirot, he waved the name away like cigar smoke. Poirot was a gossip with a keyboard. He liked digging in things he shouldn't, such as family trusts, historical discrepancies, old wills. Honestly, the man had an unhealthy interest in our lineage. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. If someone took his notes, they probably did him a favor, saved him from libel. Did you have access to the cellar? Of course not. My wife drinks wine. I don't even like the smell. That made two of them, Wolfe and Howard. Maybe they should start a support group. His wife, Lillian, proved harder to pin down. She declined to meet, citing migraine and disinterest in nonsense. Cecily, the rogue daughter-in-law, however, invited me for tea and wore a smile like it had teeth. Poirot was charming. Then he wasn't. He started asking questions that had nothing to do with wine, such as why my late husband's inheritance was delayed, why Everett still lived here despite legal disputes, whether Adeline and Gerda had been friends before Gerda became staff, that sort of thing. Did you answer? Not all of them. But I told him this. If you go digging for ghosts, don't be surprised when something bites. I liked Cecily. She spoke like someone who'd watched her family rot from the inside and kept a diary on the process. After a few more shallow dives with Otto the groundskeeper, blank stares and engine grease, and Gerda's stiff formality, no helpful memory, I made my way back to the brownstone and handed Wolfe my notes. He skimmed them silently, his lips tightening only once at the mention of the Chilean varietal being a cover for records. That might ruin people. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about suspects or motives. "It is not theft," he said. "No," I asked. "It is containment." Someone wanted that file not destroyed, but contained, hidden, possibly nearby. Nearby? He looked up. "Archie, I need you to acquire 2 things tomorrow." "Shoot." "A blueprint of the Mulliner cellar and a wine catalogue. Their full inventory, vintage and shelf placement. I suspect we're looking not for an absence, but for a presence that shouldn't be there." That was Wolfe, always looking not at the hole, but at the edge around it. By mid-morning the next day, I had secured both of Wolfe's requests, one by charm, the other by forged urgency. The blueprint came courtesy of a dusty office at City Records, where I played the role of a preservationist restoring historical estate layouts. The clerk didn't care as long as I didn't ask him to find it myself. As for the wine inventory, I convinced a rattled under-butler at the Mulliner place to slip me a copy on the condition that I not mention his name, and pretend I was requesting it for valuation insurance. I didn't ask if that was a real thing. Back at the brownstone, I laid the prints out on Wolfe's desk. He barely nodded, gestured for me to sit, and began going through them like he was deciphering ancient manuscripts. I let the silence stretch as he mumbled to himself about dimensions, placements, and cooling units. "It's off," he said finally, tapping a fingernail against the blueprint. "What is?" "This shelf." He pointed to a side alcove in the cellar layout, nestled behind one of the cooling ducts. "It was installed later. The material is different. See the annotation, Unit D, 1949 edition, red oak instead of standard pine. And it appears in the blueprint, but not in the inventory. I checked the wine catalogue, and sure enough, Unit D was blank. No listings, no vintage tags, just a gap where names should be. Maybe it's where they keep the empties," I offered. Wolfe gave me a glance that could have soured milk. "Don't be jedgin'. Then what is it?" "A hiding place. It fits the logic. If the file was removed not to destroy it, but to suppress it, then the thief had to do it subtly, and they couldn't have taken it far. Every member of that household is too self-interested to risk being caught transporting sensitive information. So they hid it in plain sight." "Precisely." I nodded. "You want me to go back?" "Not yet. We need corroboration. Find someone in the estates. Orbit who's handled those shelves. A wine supplier, a mover, a contractor, someone who's been in that cellar and might know if anything's off. And how do I get that without triggering alarms? By being exactly who you are," Wolfe said, settling back with that smug stillness that meant I was the legs and he was the brain. "A charming, unscrupulous busybody with a badge of Fox authority. Flattery will get you a Hungarian pastry with lunch," I said, standing. It took most of the afternoon to coffees and a cigarette break disguised as networking. But I finally got a name: Desmond Strake, owner of Strake's Estate Logistics, a private moving and cataloging service for high-end residences and legacy homes. He remembered the Mulliner job well, not least because he'd had a brief and unpleasant interaction with Nigel Parlow during the process. He was one of those types, Desmond told me. his voice rough with dust or disapproval. Thought every bottle was a secret. Treated me like a pickpocket just for carrying crates. Did you touch the Unit D shelf? He gave me a blank look, then chuckled. You mean the dummy rack? Dummy. It's not real. Not fully. Only the first row's legit. The rest is a false face over a hollow. They use it for temporary storage, emergency stash. Mrs. Mulliner told us to ignore it during the main cataloguing. That was the gold. I thanked him, made a note to recommend his company to no one, and headed straight back to the brownstone. Wolfe barely looked up as I relayed what Strake had said. Good, he muttered. Very good. The file was not stolen. It was reclassified, meaning someone knew the inventory would be. Copied. Knew the file couldn't leave the premises, so they buried it, unlisted, among the bottles in Unit D. Then it's still there, possibly, or it was moved again. Regardless, we now know two things. 1. The file wasn't destroyed, and 2. The person who took it had prior access to the cellar and enough authority to alter how it was documented, which means Adeline or Gerda or Howard. If he manipulated the schedule and had a key copied, or Cecily, if she still has access nobody tracked, or Lillian, if she faked a migraine and used it as cover, or Otto, I said. Because why not include the guy with a wrench and a motive? We haven't figured out yet. Wolfe actually smiled. It was small, grim, and short-lived. Archie, we need to bring them in. Now. No. We need more. Bring Saul in. Have him run background checks on the household's financial trust funds. Inheritance changes. Real estate activity. Sudden travel. Anything coinciding with the date the file vanished. Understood. And you, he said, fixing me with that stare he saves for moments when I think about skipping lunch. We'll return to the estate tomorrow under the pretense of final clarification. Ask about the dummy rack directly. Note reactions, especially from Gerda. I tapped my notebook. Think she's the linchpin. She's the only one who answers to no one but Adeline, and whose presence is never questioned. If a file was hidden, she either saw it or helped place it. I nodded, then hesitated. Wolfe? Yes? Why are we taking this case? Really? You said no. Then yes. What changed? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped the wine catalogue with one thick finger, because there's something here that wasn't meant to be found, and because someone went to great lengths to bury truth beneath trivia. That offends me. Intellectually and morally. He paused, then added, also. Poirot promised me a bottle of wine that no longer exists. If it's authentic, it would be. The first time a liar brought me something worth drinking. I left the office with a grin and a phone call to Saul. The case had traction now. Not fast, not loud, but like pressure building in a sealed room. Back in my room, I started writing out the timeline. The cellar had been accessed on Tuesday. Poirot discovered the file missing on Wednesday. On Thursday, Adeline made a quiet call to her estate lawyer. On Friday, Gerda moved a crate from the cellar to the upstairs pantry. And on Saturday, I walked into this fermenting mess and shook the bottle. Tomorrow, I'd go back and rattle it again. I arrived at the Mulliner estate the next morning with a pressed jacket, a fake reason, and Wolfe's curiosity burning a hole in my pocket. The butler, no doubt warned by Adeline to keep the riffraff moving, looked at me like I'd tracked in something unspeakable. I smiled anyway and asked for Goethe. It was time to prod the quiet one. Goethe Lemke met me in the rear garden, where she was clipping roses with slow, deliberate snips, like they had personally offended her. She wore a charcoal grey uniform that had seen more starch than conversation, and had the kind of posture that told you she either feared no one or feared everything in silence. "I won't take more than 10 minutes, I told her. "You said that yesterday." "Then call it a tradition," I said, stepping beside her. She didn't stop clipping. "You're not the police." "Nope. Just the next best thing, an irritant with an excellent memory and a boss who doesn't leave the house," she said. Nothing but her clippers slowed. I decided to push. "Mr. Wolfe has a few clarifying questions about the wine cellar inventory, particularly about the section labeled Unit D." The shears paused mid-snip. "There is no Unit D," she said. Quiet, flat. "There's no recorded Unit D." I corrected. "But there's a shelf, Oak, added in 49. You and Mrs. Mulliner both have keys to the cellar, so I'm wondering, did you ever use that shelf? Move anything from it?" Her hands returned to motion, though I noticed she chose a stem with no thorns this time. "Nothing is stored there. It is unstable. Funny, a contractor I spoke to said it's been stable for decades. Even called it a dummy rack. Said it's hollow behind the first row. That man was careless," she said. "He chipped a vintage bottle and lied about it." "So you do remember him?" She finally turned toward me. Her eyes were pale, but not soft. "I remember everything." "I'll bet," I said then. "You also remember the night Poirot left his satchel in the cellar?" She didn't answer. "He says it vanished. We say it was hidden. Wolfe thinks it's still in the house." "I think you saw who took it." She gave a slow blink, then turned back to her roses. "I see many things, Mr. Goodwin. I do not always comment." "You don't have to comment. You just have to confirm that it was moved. We're not accusing you." She snapped the stem in half and dropped it. "That shelf has not been touched." That's when I knew she was lying. It wasn't just the contradiction, it was the calm. People telling the truth get twitchy under pressure. People lying try to slow the world down. She was putting her foot on the brakes. I thanked her for her time, said nothing more, and wandered back into the house, where I found Howard in the parlor thumbing through an economics magazine and pretending not to care. "You again," he said. "I was just starting to miss you." "That's what I do," I said. "Leave people with the feeling something was just stolen." He offered a half smile. "Are we getting close to an arrest? Getting close to something? Wolfe is narrowing the timeline. Wants to know about your late father's wine purchases. Anything off book? Any private acquisitions?" Howard shrugged. He bought in bulk and in secret. Loved mystery vintages, rare Portuguese batches, obscure German Rieslings, even bottles with no visible label. Said if you knew the name, it wasn't worth the taste. Did he ever store personal documents in the cellar? He glanced up. No. But he did store one thing. What? Leverage. He grinned. You think my mother's the matriarch. My father had a different mistress every 5 years, and an insurance folder on every one of them. Poirot might have found that. If he did, someone panicked. Like who? Howard didn't hesitate. Cecily. She sued for part of the estate. After my father died, claimed emotional damage. She lost, but just barely. If there was proof, he kept tabs on her pictures, receipts, recordings she'd kill to bury it. That sounded juicy, so I logged it for Wolfe and made my way toward the kitchen. Cecily was at the table with a crossword and a cup of something. That steamed like guilt. You're not really here for wine questions, are you? She said without looking up. I'm not really here for tea either, I replied. I need to know what you were doing the day Poirot lost his file. She shrugged, avoiding Nigel Poirot. He made himself unwelcome fast. Because of what he found. Because of how he found it. He had that smug look of someone who'd peeked under the rug and found something better than dust. Like what? Like old names, old threats. My husband wasn't the only one who dealt with inheritance disputes. Adeline had lovers before her marriage. One of them gave her more than affection, he gave her leverage. And Poirot found out. How? I don't know. But he told me once, during a wine break, that family trees should come with pruning shears. You ever go in the cellar alone? She raised an eyebrow. You asking if I stole the file? Not yet. Then don't ask unless you have a witness or a recording, because I don't like accusations. And I bite harder than I look. Noted. I left her and ran into auto-polishing doorknobs near the east hallway. I tried the friendly approach, asking about bottles, boxes, and movements during the last week. He answered in grunts and monosyllables when I mentioned the dummy shelf. He blinked like I'd asked him to read Latin, then said, Moss says not to touch that one. That was something. Gerda had told someone not to go near the shelf, which meant she either knew something was there or feared someone else would find out. I made my way back to the brownstone and delivered the load to Wolfe while Fritz served us lamb with apricot glaze. Wolfe listened in silence, then pushed his plate away without comment. That was never a good sign. When he finally spoke, he said, It's not Gerda. I blinked. Come again. She lied. But not to protect herself. She lied to protect order. She views this house as her kingdom. To admit someone tampered with it under her watch would collapse her identity. Then who? Cecily. He said, not pausing. She had motive. She feared exposure. And she had a pattern litigation, emotional leverage, and a disdain for scrutiny. You think she took it? No, he said, adjusting slightly in his chair. I think she moved it. But someone else watched her do it. Gerda? No. Otto? You said, he repeated a direct quote. Ma says not to touch that one. That's not protection. That's shielding. He saw it being used, perhaps even helped. I leaned back. Then we're getting close. Very close, Wolfe murmured. It's time we collect them. All of them? Yes. The family, the staff. I want them in my office tomorrow. You will call. No excuses. No absences. If they resist, tell them I already know what happened. That should loosen tongues. Is that true? I asked. Of course not, he said, closing his eyes. But it will be. I've seen a lot of reactions when I tell people Nero Wolfe wants a word. Some raise their eyebrows like they've just heard God request a private audience. Others roll their eyes and assume it's some harmless eccentric in a bathrobe. The Mulliner crowd did neither. What they did was more telling. They all hesitated. The kind of pause you see when someone realizes their carefully stacked lies might be scheduled for public demolition. I made the calls just after breakfast. Adeline Mulliner answered with a clipped yes, and didn't even let me finish before, saying, "We'll come, on one condition: no press, no police." She was bluffing power, which meant Wolfe had already gotten under her skin. Howard responded with forced civility, and the question, should I bring legal counsel? I told him to bring only a clear conscience if he could find one. Cecily made a joke about Wolfe's orchid obsession and said she hoped our guest chairs were comfortable. Because she had a lot to say, Lillian didn't answer at all. Gerda returned my call later and said she and Otto would come. Her voice was flat but not defiant, which meant she was scared but not of Wolfe. By 4 p.m. The brownstone was as crowded as it ever gets. Fritz polished the banister 3 times. Saul Panzer sat quietly in the front room, flipping through a newspaper and blending in like the professional shadow he is. Wolfe remained upstairs in the plant rooms until the very last second, which was both strategy and performance. The doorbell rang, Fritz opened, and the circus arrived. They came in one by one, led by Adeline, who wore black like she was auditioning for a silent terror funeral. Howard followed, gripping his phone like it might start emitting bail options. Cecily arrived last, looking amused and possibly a little drunk, while Otto trailed Gerda with the downcast stare of someone used to being present but never counted. I brought them into the office and arranged the seating like a poker table. No one too close, no one too safe. Wolfe came down exactly on time, sank into his chair, and let the silence work for him. It did. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, folding his hands over his belly, "let us be efficient. You know why you're here?" Howard tried a smirk. "Because Parlow misplaced a satchel." Wolfe stared at him. "Because one of you moved a file containing material damaging to this family, material that was not yours to touch. It has not been recovered. It is, however, no longer lost." That got them. Gerda blinked. Cecily straightened. Adeline folded her arms. Otto picked at a thread on his sleeve. Wolfe continued. "The file was not stolen for profit. It was concealed, buried. Its removal served a precise function to delay its discovery until certain other matters could be settled." "What matters?" Cecily asked. Her voice was sharper than it had been in previous chats. "Legal maneuverings, inheritance disputes, reputation salvaging." Adeline snapped. "That's absurd. The file was never seen by anyone but Parlow." "Incorrect," Wolfe said. "The file was seen by at least 2 others. One who feared it, and one who moved it. No one spoke. The tension was marinating now." "I have here," Wolfe said, gesturing to a sheet on his desk, An exact floor. Layout of your wine cellar, including the dummy shelf in Unit D. Adeline stiffened. That's not on any public record. Indeed, Wolfe said, but Strake's Logistics, your movers, remembered it well. You told them to ignore it. Why? She hesitated. Because it was unstable. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. Or because it was being used. She said nothing. The shelf, Wolfe continued, was empty according to inventory. And yet Mr. Goodwin noted your housekeeper specifically warned her, son, not to touch it. Why? Gerda sat still as stone. Because it contained something unrecorded. Something placed there by a member of your household. Something that had to be retrieved quietly, without alerting others. Howard leaned forward. You're guessing. You don't have the file. No. Wolfe admitted. But I will. And, more importantly, I already know who removed it. That was the moment, the tightrope moment, when someone either confesses or collapses. Cecily laughed softly. Let me guess. Me. No. Wolfe said. Not you. You moved the file. But you did not act alone. She blinked. Wolfe turned to Otto. Your mother told you to keep away from the shelf. But she didn't tell you why. She was protecting you because you saw Cecily take something and place it there, didn't you? Otto looked at the floor. Everyone stared at him. Otto, Wolfe said, his tone gentler, you helped her carry the crate. You thought it was just wine. But when she left, you looked inside. You saw papers, notes, names. Gerda's hand closed over Otto's. Don't say anything, she said quietly. It's all right, Ma. Otto muttered. He looked up at Wolfe. I saw it. A binder. With Mr. Poirot's name on it. And some pictures. Old ones. Letters, too. I didn't read it all. Just enough to know it wasn't ours. And then, Wolfe asked. I didn't touch it, but someone else did. 2 nights later, the crate was gone. Who took it? Otto hesitated. It's all right, Wolfe said again. The truth doesn't hurt as much as the lie. Otto looked straight at Adeline. She did. Gasps. Real and theatrical. Filled the room. Adeline's face hardened. That's a lie, she said. No, Wolfe said. It fits. Cecily moved the file to suppress a scandal involving her, and your late husband likely proof of emotional coercion and manipulation. But you feared something else. The binder also contained early correspondence between your husband and one of your former partners, a man who fathered Howard, a man who paid for your silence. That truth could destroy Howard's claim to the estate. Adeline turned slowly. Howard, don't listen to this. But Howard was pale. You took the file from Unit D and hid it again. This time where no one would look. Perhaps behind another shelf. Perhaps destroyed. But you didn't account for Otto. Adeline rose. This is a mockery. I won't. You will, Wolfe said. Voice firm. Because what you've done is not merely conceal evidence. You attempted to suppress familial identity for financial gain. Poirot was going to publish. You couldn't afford that. She sat down again, her hands trembling. Wolfe leaned back. I do not care for your family's squabbles, but I care for logic. And what I see here is a chain of self-protecting liars. undone by a boy who watched and remembered. I looked at Otto. He was shaking, but not crying. Goethe held his hand tighter. Adeline said nothing. Wolfe looked at me. Archie, call Mr. Poirot. Tell him his file is being recovered, though somewhat altered. Yes, sir. And the rest of you, Wolfe said, may leave. Your secrets are already bleeding out. Best to bandage them in private. The room emptied in silence. Otto glanced back once. Goethe nodded at Wolfe, just once, when the door closed. Wolfe exhaled. That, he muttered, was unpleasant, but efficient. I said. He closed his eyes. Fritz, beer. The next morning arrived the way most Manhattan mornings do, grey, brisk, and pretending to be polite. Fritz was already clinking around the kitchen, and Wolfe was, predictably, not yet speaking. He was, however, reading. The newspaper lay in front of him, like an accused man awaiting sentencing. His eyes moved methodically, which meant he was processing silently, assembling loose ends into something unpleasantly tight. I've called Poirot, I said, setting my cup down on the corner of the desk. He's ecstatic, said. He's on his way with a bottle of that impossible Chilean red. Wolfe grunted, which in his language meant, I'll believe that when I see the cork. He also said he wanted to retrieve the binder himself. Said he doesn't trust the Mulliners to hand it over intact, as he shouldn't, Wolfe replied. They've had ample opportunity to cleanse its contents. If anything remains, it will be either overlooked or deliberately planted. That wasn't news. I leaned back. So, what's bothering you? Wolfe didn't answer immediately. He closed the paper and steepled his fingers. We are missing something. I thought we had everything: motive, movement, even a witness. Yes, but only for the concealment. His voice grew tighter. We know who moved the file. We do not yet know why it was created. I frowned. Poirot created it. He was cataloguing. He found dirt. He put it together. No, Poirot organized it, but its existence predates him. That binder was assembled before his involvement. He only added commentary. I sat up. You think someone in the family compiled the original? Yes, or someone close to them. Someone who wanted to document the family's improprieties. Quietly, thoroughly, possibly even for leverage. Then Poirot stumbled onto it. Correct. And became a liability the moment he realized what he'd found. And Adeline reacted. By moving it, Cecily tried to keep it hidden. But neither of them built the foundation. Exactly. Just then, Fritz poked his head in. Mr. Nigel Poirot is here. With a case, singular or plural? Wolfe asked. A single bottle, sir, and one arm wrapped around it like a first-born child. Poirot entered before introductions could be repeated. He looked slightly cleaner than last time, but not much calmer. His hair had been recently combed, and his tweed jacket was sporting a new coffee stain. He held a narrow bottle encased in aged paper, with a label so faded it might as well have been blank. I deliver, he said triumphantly, setting it on Wolfe's desk. Wolfe didn't even look at it. The binder, Poirot's grin faltered, still at the estate. I called ahead. Goethe said she would leave it with the front desk. which means, Wolfe said, that it is now either redacted, duplicated, or rigged. Poirot sat down. I took precautions. I had already photographed the entire thing, pages, inserts, even handwritten a deader. I saved the files offline. I raised an eyebrow. You never mentioned that before. I didn't trust anyone, including you. Wolfe smirked slightly. Wise. And what did you learn from it? Poirot leaned forward. The binder was started by a man named Martin Everfield, a private accountant. Worked for the Mulliner patriarch for over a decade. When he was diagnosed with cancer, he began organizing the families off the record dealings assets, blackmail payouts, hush agreements. He left the binder behind after his death, thinking someone would eventually clean out the wine cellar. Instead, it sat untouched until you. I said, until me. He agreed. And why didn't you say this earlier? Poirot hesitated. Because the file contained more than Mulliner sins. It had names, other families, donors, political figures, things I wasn't sure you'd want to know. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. I do not care for power. I care for precision. You would have spared us ours had you said so. Poirot shrugged. I wanted to be sure you wouldn't sell it. Insulting, Wolfe muttered. But effective, Poirot said. You stayed the course. Wolfe waved him off. Have Mr. Panzer retrieve the binder. If it is not intact, we will compare it to your copies. I called Saul immediately. He was already downtown. He agreed to stop at the estate and check with Goethe personally. I had no doubt he'd get the file even if he had to unbutton his lapel once or twice. When Wolfe and Poirot were alone again, the conversation shifted. Wolfe inspected the Chilean wine finally, holding the bottle at eye level, noting the dust, the wax seal, the embossed serial number half worn by time. This should not exist, he murmured. But it does. Poirot beamed. The vineyard, burned in 1944. This bottle came from a collector in Mendoza. It was part of a trade, 3 bottles of this for a rare Bordeaux. I never thought I'd part with it. Then why now? Because I needed your mind. And minds like yours are not persuaded by money or favors. Only challenge. Wolfe stared at the bottle. A poor investment, Mr. Poirot. I am no longer challenged. Merely curious. Just then, Saul returned, binder in hand. He nodded to me. As he handed it over, intact, he said, pages matched Poirot's copies. But I noticed something. What? Wolfe asked. Saul looked at me. A loose photograph tucked into the back cover. Fresh, not old like the others. Poirot leaned in. I didn't see that. I opened the binder. Sure enough. Tucked behind the back flap was a glossy black and white photo developed recently. It showed Adeline Mulliner standing in a hallway, talking to a man whose face was blurred by motion. I handed it to Wolfe. This is a warning, Wolfe said after a beat. From who? I asked. From whoever still has access to the estate and knew Poirot would retrieve the binder. Someone watching. Poirot paled. But everyone was in your office. No, not everyone. Wolfe stared at the image. Everett Mulliner, the late patriarch's brother. Not once has he spoken. Not once has he interfered. Which means he's watching. From the inside. I said, exactly. Wolfe nodded. And if he's the one who discovered Everfield's binder, then he allowed it to remain hidden. Until now, Poirot stood. You think he'll retaliate? No, Wolfe said. He'll wait. That's what men like him do. Poirot collected the binder, carefully tucking it into a satchel lined with foam. I'll publish. Names redacted. But the truth will surface. Do as you please, Wolfe said. But be warned, every family has its cellar, some deeper than others. Poirot nodded and left with the bottle under one arm and the truth under the other. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Archie? Yes, sir. We are done. No final remarks on human duplicity. No elegant takedown of inherited cowardice. Wolfe sniffed. I am more interested in the wine. He opened the bottle, poured 2 fingers into a crystal glass, sniffed once, and sipped. Well, he considered, swirled, and swallowed. Acceptable, he said. I laughed. That's your verdict after all that? He looked at me. Would you prefer a lecture? Maybe tomorrow. Then let me enjoy this. So I left him there sitting in silence, cradling a glass of myth, and pondering the flavors of hidden files, family lies, and the bitter finish of truth. The days that followed were quiet, which usually means Wolfe is either digesting victory or doubting it. With Wolfe, you never really know until he speaks. I'd seen him mull over cases he'd already solved just to find the thread he didn't pull. And this one it had left a loose end the size of a wine barrel. Everett Mulliner. He'd never spoken, never appeared, not a whisper of protest during the office showdown. But Wolfe hadn't forgotten him. When Wolfe doesn't mention someone, it means he's staring straight at them. And sure enough, 3 days after Poirot left with the infamous binder, Wolfe summoned me into the office with a peculiar tone. Archie, contact Everett Mulliner. Contact him how? I asked. He's a recluse, doesn't answer the door, doesn't answer questions, and certainly doesn't answer phones. Wolfe gave me the look he reserves for particularly stubborn salad ingredients. Find a way. So I did, and it involved the kind of method Wolfe loathes: improvisation. I paid a second visit to the Mulliner estate under the guise of returning a misdelivered envelope, and by some stroke of charm or possibly just inertia I managed to convince Goethe to leave me alone in the hall where Everett's quarters were said to be. A few knocks. No answer, but I didn't leave. I waited, and after 6 full minutes, the door creaked open. He looked older than the rest of them by 10 years, but wore it better. Trim beard, thin silver hair, and a gaze that had the unfortunate quality of seeing everything. He didn't speak right away, just studied me like I was an old painting in poor lighting. I'm Archie Goodwin, I said. I work for Nero Wolfe. He blinked once. I'd like to speak with you about the file. Still nothing. But then he opened the door wider and gestured for me to come in. Everett Mulliner's room was a contradiction, a war between old world silence and modern observation. Books lined the walls, not one out of place. A small television sat off in the corner, untouched, and a single notebook sat open on his writing desk, with pen marks trailing across it like a private map. You know about the binder, I said. Once seated, you knew before anyone else did. He finally spoke. Of course I did. I created it. That was a twist even Wolfe hadn't said aloud. You're Martin Everfield? No, he said calmly. But I paid him. I gave him the material. My brother was a fraud. He manipulated our inheritance system, married for financial leverage, and destroyed 3 people in the process. 3, my first partner, my niece's first fiancé, and the housekeeper's sister. I took a second to breathe that in. You kept that quiet. I had no choice. My brother had power. He had the board's loyalty and the legal structures to erase evidence. But I knew one day someone like Poirot would come. So I documented everything. Had Everfield organize it before he passed. And you just waited until the right eyes saw it. Poirot was a loud man. But he wasn't corrupt. He'd published the truth. That was enough. But when the binder was moved, you didn't intervene. No, because I knew Wolfe would. I blinked. You knew Wolfe would take the case? I didn't know. He corrected. I counted on it. The man was 2 steps ahead of us all. I whistled. And the photo. He almost smiled, a reminder to Adeline that I still see, and a nudge to Wolfe. He would recognize a fresh detail. Out of context. He always does. I sat back. You manipulated the entire family into exposure. No, he said. I waited for their arrogance to do it for me. Why now? My health is failing, he said flatly, and I didn't want the next generation to inherit the same rot. I nodded. It wasn't justice. Exactly. But it was close enough to smell like it. Back at the brownstone, I relayed everything. Wolfe listened, eyes closed, hands resting on his stomach like he'd known all along, but had waited for me to catch up. He created the binder, I said, paid for it, orchestrated the placement, allowed Poirot to find it, nudged us into play. Wolfe opened his eyes. Satisfactory. That's it? I asked. He practically used us as pawns. No. Wolfe said he used us as instruments. There's a difference. Pawns are moved. Instruments are played. And you're fine with that? I was not played, he said, reaching for his beer. I was conducted, gracefully. I shook my head. You're really going to let Everett Mulliner walk away with this? No confrontation? No final exchange? There's nothing to exchange, Wolfe replied. He wanted the truth exposed. It has been. He made no money, no headlines, and took no credit. That is not a criminal. That is an aging man who finally told the truth. So we close the file. Wolfe nodded. We close the file. And he meant it. That night, while Wolfe retreated upstairs to inspect his orchids and contemplate morality over potting soil, I sat in the office and looked through the final report. Saul had already summarized everything: inheritance fraud, blackmail documentation, 3 possible cover-ups, and a trail of silence that had stretched for years. Now exposed, the Mulliner family, for all their wealth and wines, had built their empire on rotting timbers. Wolfe didn't need to destroy them. They were already splintering under their own secrets. As I filed everything away, I thought about Otto, about Goethe, about Everett, about the quiet people who had seen too much and said too little. Sometimes Justice isn't loud. It's a slow settling of weight, a chair creaking in the next room. A folder finally opened after years of dust. And sometimes the file isn't hidden in the cellar. Sometimes it is the cellar. 2 days passed. Wolfe didn't speak of the case. Again he returned to his routine, with the precision of a man determined to forget that human beings existed beyond orchid petals and Fritz's impeccable meals. But I wasn't ready to close the book. Not yet. Something about Everett's calm unsettled me, not because it was rehearsed, but because it wasn't. He told the truth, yes, but with the kind of composure that hinted there was still a second, half waiting to be turned over, and Wolfe, for all his intellect, was letting it lie. I decided to poke at it. "You think Everett really wanted justice?" I asked over breakfast. Wolfe didn't lift his eyes from his scrambled eggs. He exposed the rot. "That was his aim." "Sure," I said. "But what about the rest? The fact that he documented half the city's elite in that file? That binder wasn't just a Mulliner tell-all. It had judges, business partners, political donations, and transactions that smelled like favors." Wolfe chewed slowly. "You believe he had larger intentions?" "I believe men who move pawns don't stop at the board's edge." Wolfe set down his fork. "Then speak plainly. Everett's been quiet for years, watching his family decay from inside. But he didn't leak the file to the press. He gave it to Poirot, a small-time archivist, and he let us sweep up the fragments. Why?" Wolfe finally met my eyes. "Because Poirot is controllable, and we are predictable. A scandal through the press would have caused chaos, but filtered through us, the damage is localized." I blinked. "So you do think we were played?" "No." He wiped his mouth. "I think we were used. Subtly. But in the end, we served his purpose." I stood, grabbing my coat. "Well, I'm not done. I'm going to find out if Everett's still conducting symphonies behind closed doors." "You won't find him," Wolfe said. "He's already gone." He was right. The Mulliner estate answered, but Everett was no longer accepting visitors. The man had vanished. Gerda didn't know. Otto didn't know. Adeline claimed he'd simply retired to one of the other properties. Lillian hung up. And Howard left a message that sounded suspiciously like he was relieved. Back at the brownstone, I found something on my desk. A slim envelope, no name, just my initials, typed. Inside was a note, handwritten on heavy paper. "Ma. Goodwin, thank you for your persistence. Truth, like wine, matures best in silence. I've left the city. What remains is yours to interpret. But know this, nothing I did was for legacy." Below the note was a key. I recognized it by its make, one of the cellar keys, but not the main door. This one was for the auxiliary cabinet. I took it straight to Wolfe. He examined the key, then the note, then leaned back with a grunt. "He left you a parting gift. A trap?" "No." An answer. "We made arrangements. Wolfe stayed, of course. I went back to the estate that evening. The staff let me in with barely a glance. No one asked questions. They probably assumed I was back to settle more secrets. The auxiliary cabinet was tucked in the northeast corner of the cellar, behind 2 shelves and a dusty curtain. The lock clicked open with the key, and inside was a box, not wine, not files. Tapes. Old. Real recordings, each labeled in Everett's careful script. Dates, names, and one label that stopped my breath cold. Gerda Lemp Confession 1972. There were others: business meetings, legal agreements, financial discussions between the late Mr. Mulliner and associates, blackmail, at scale. Everett had not only documented everything, he'd recorded it, and he'd left it with me. I brought the tapes back to Wolfe. He handled them like they were radioactive. "This," I said, "is the rest of the iceberg." "Yes," Wolfe murmured, "and we are beneath the surface now." We listened to one. Gerda's voice came through, brittle and tired, speaking of her sister's death. Not an accident, a payoff. The Mulliner patriarch had arranged it after an affair turned threatening. There was money, silence, and years of guilt. Wolfe stopped the tape. "We cannot keep this," he said, "but we can't ignore it either." "No," Wolfe agreed, "but we must decide who receives it." I looked at him. "Everett chose us." "Yes," Wolfe said quietly, "and I despise him for it." That night, we didn't sleep. We catalogued. We transcribed. By morning, we had an index that implicated half a dozen powerful men. One judge, one bishop, to city councilmen. All of it whispered in rooms, caught on tape by a man no one had questioned in 30 years. And it wasn't just dirt, it was rot. "What now?" I asked. Wolfe poured himself a beer. "We send one copy to Poirot, redacted, another to the district attorney, quietly, with a letter, no fanfare, and the rest?" Wolfe stared out the window. "We store it, with Fritz's help, and we forget it until remembering becomes necessary." So we did. The Mulliner story faded from the press. Poirot published a clean version, just enough scandal to sell, not enough to destroy. The DA launched a quiet inquiry that went nowhere fast. Power protects itself, after all. And Everett, gone. No forwarding address, no obituary, just silence. But in the brownstone, a locked drawer now holds reels of truth that might one day explode. And Wolfe? He returned to his orchids. Occasionally, he mentions vintage reds, but never Chilean. And me? I keep the key, just in case, to weeks past. Wolfe said nothing more about the tapes. He returned to the rhythms of orchid schedules and gourmet indulgences, as if the Mulliner scandal had been a brief gust in his otherwise insulated life. Fritz resumed his meals with a touch more spice, perhaps sensing the tension that neither Wolfe nor I wanted to name. But me, I couldn't leave it behind. Not yet, because something was still off. The tapes hadn't just exposed historical crimes, they had documented a pattern. The Mulliner patriarch hadn't been a rogue actor. He had been a node in a network. And if Everett had recorded it, it meant he'd seen where it connected. But there had been no blueprint, no summary, no ledger tying it together. Only fragments, names, moments, whispers, enough to threaten, not enough to map. That was the part that haunted me. Wolfe noticed. "He always does. You're brooding," he said one afternoon as I stood by the window, watching the clouds look like they were deciding whether or not to rain. "I'm thinking." That is a generous interpretation. I turned. You ever wonder why Everett didn't spell it out? He raised one eyebrow. Spell what out? The structure, the network, the grand design behind the tapes. Wolfe returned to his book. Because he didn't want to, or because he didn't know how. That's what bothers me, I said. He was meticulous, exacting. He documented everything. But he left the dots unconnected. Perhaps he left that for you. I paused. You think this was deliberate? Wolfe didn't answer, which meant he did. That night, I went back to the drawer. The tapes sat in their cases like dormant landmines. I pulled out the index we'd written names, locations, dates and laid it out across the office floor. Fritz grumbled, but I told him I'd clean it later. And I started to connect them first by year, then by topic, then by overlap. One pattern emerged quickly: 1972, 1975, 1979, every 3 years. The Marner patriarch had hosted what was labeled in the tapes as a wine convening. That was the term Everett used. It sounded innocent, but the voices on the tapes weren't talking about wine. They were talking about land deals, trust shifts, silent partnerships, and protecting our friends from unfortunate scrutiny. There was even a reference, casual, buried in chatter, to a judge who did well to keep that photographer from testifying. No name, just tone. It wasn't wine tasting. It was coordination. And one more thing, they were all men. Always. Men. Everett had captured the edge of a covert circle. Not one based on crime. Exactly, but on insulation, protection, influence pooled like brandy. I took the notes to Wolfe. He read them in silence, then said, "We must make a decision." About what? About keeping this. I frowned. You mean destroy it? No, but we cannot keep it here. Not all of it. Not indefinitely. So what do we do? He tapped the list. There is one man who might use this without misusing it. I raised an eyebrow. You thinking about Kramer? Wolfe gave the closest thing he could to a wince without blinking. No, not Inspector Kramer. This is not his terrain. Then who? Wolfe reached for the phone and dialed. When he gave the name, I nearly choked on my coffee. The man Wolfe called was a district ethics commissioner, retired, discreet, and, more importantly, someone who owed Wolfe a favor from a decade back when his daughter had been falsely accused. In a corporate bribery mess, Wolfe had cleared it without ever meeting her. When Wolfe calls in a favor, it's never for a dinner reservation. By the next afternoon, the commissioner arrived at the brownstone. He came alone, wore no tie, and listened for 2 hours straight as Wolfe laid out what he had, what it implied, and what it threatened. I watched the man pale by degrees. At the end, he said only, "I'll need a secure courier." Wolfe nodded. "You'll get one copy, no originals, and your terms, no credit, no questions. If it becomes public, I was never involved." The commissioner agreed, and the next morning the tapes were gone. Not all of them, but the worst of them. The ones that connected names to leverage. Wolfe never said it, but I knew he'd decided something that day, something final. His job wasn't to set the world on fire, just to light enough candles to make the shadows shrink. Still, The case wasn't over, not to me, because that night I received a second envelope. No key this time. Just a message. Truth is not just what's recorded, it's what's remembered. Do not forget the silence between the words. I didn't show it to Wolfe. I didn't need to. He already understood. Everett hadn't vanished to escape justice. He'd vanished to let it breathe. There was no final confrontation, no confession, no arrest. Just the slow unraveling of a legacy to protected for too long. And as Wolfe sat that evening, reading a book on Roman philosophy and sipping that final glass of the Chilean red, he spoke without looking up. Justice is rarely swift, but it always arrives, eventually. I nodded and wrote that line down. Because some truths don't go in the file. They go in the memory. The house settled back into its usual rhythm. Fritz returned to poaching halibut in tarragon butter. Saul drifted into the shadows like he'd never existed. And Wolfe resumed his botanical sermons to rows of orchids who, I assume, appreciated his intellect more than most humans did. As for me, I kept a copy of the index. Wolfe didn't object. He understood that memory, like leverage, was safest in more than one place. But the real end didn't come with a gavel or a gun. It came in the form of an article, buried in the back of the Times 3 weeks later. Not on the front page, not even page 10. Page 22. Mulliner Foundation dissolves amid quiet investigation. No names, no admissions, just a line. Sources cite irregularities in historical financials and stewardship transfers. That was all. A dynasty dying in the margins. I showed Wolfe the clipping at breakfast. He read it twice, then folded the paper and went back to his soft-boiled eggs. Not enough, I asked. It is sufficient. That's it. That is justice. In its most plausible form. I didn't disagree, but I didn't celebrate either. Because what we'd uncovered, Deverett's tapes, the Cellar file, the 3-decade conspiracy, it hadn't gone away. It had simply been acknowledged quietly and allowed to retreat into history's shadow like so many buried scandals before it. Wolfe never expected applause. He expected finality, and that, at least, we had. Poirot published an op-ed shortly after, not naming names, but speaking about the moral weight of private archives and the duty of the observer. It was pretentious enough to be ignored, but precise enough to stir whispers. Wolfe read it, didn't comment. I asked him once more, just once, whether he thought Everett Mulliner had been a hero. He closed his eyes and said, "Heroes rarely record their sins, but he recorded others." Yes, and withheld his own. That is control, not courage. I nodded. Fair enough. The key Everett left me now sits in my desk drawer. I've tried it once or twice just to be sure it didn't open something else. Some forgotten door or leftover lock in the maze of Mulliner secrets. But it doesn't. It only opens the cabinet in the cellar, the one where it all started, the one that, according to new ownership records, no longer exists. The estate was sold, renovated, the cellar paved and converted into a wine lounge for tastings. I never told Wolfe. He wouldn't care. But one thing I didn't mention, one thing I didn't file was that when I went to check that cabinet, one last time before it was demolished, I found something wedged behind the back panel. A small slip of paper, folded once. No names, just one line. If they ever find this, they deserve to. That was Everett's final move. Not a confession, not a threat, just a dare. And we had answered it that night. Wolfe asked for that chili and red. Again, the last glass. The bottle had been recorked, stored in our cabinet with reverence. I poured it. He sipped, swirled, and then, just before swallowing, looked at me. This, he said, has improved. Not because of age, but because of memory. I raised my own glass, just water. But the sentiment counted. To the file, I said, he didn't raise his dot, but he nodded. That was enough. The brownstone held its silence like always. But this time, it was a peaceful kind. The silence that follows not victory or defeat, but understanding. And that, in Wolfe's world, was the closest we ever got to closure. It ended, as it always did, with silence, not the sharp silence of accusation, or the strained silence of withheld truth, but the soft, settled kind, the kind that comes after a long, slow exhalation. Wolfe called it equilibrium. I called it aftermath. Either way, it felt like the brownstone itself was exhaling with us, absorbing the residue of a case that had begun in the dusty corners of a wine cellar and ended with the careful unspooling of reputations. Everett Mulliner was gone, not in the way most people go, with headlines or funerals, but in the way men like him disappear purposefully, precisely and permanently. His tapes, his binder, and his motives had unraveled a 3-decade deception, yet left no bodies, no police raids, and no sensational press conferences. The truth had emerged not with fury, but with a whisper, and that, in Wolfe's view, made it all the more effective. I'd expected Wolfe to indulge himself with one final monologue, perhaps a musing on legacy, leverage, or the intoxicating aroma of buried secrets. But he didn't. He just returned to the greenhouse, spent more hours with his orchids than usual, and only spoke when necessary. And when he did, it was never about the Mulliners, but I could tell he was still thinking. One evening, as I brought in the mail, I paused outside the greenhouse. He was standing in the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting a Miltonia that had bloomed early. I didn't interrupt. I didn't have to, Archie, he said, without turning. Yeah, there is no virtue in exposure, only in accuracy. Meaning, Everett was accurate, but not virtuous. He documented truth, but not for justice, for vindication. The distinction is subtle, but important. You think he was a coward? No. But I think he mistook observation for responsibility. That was Wolfe, always passing morality into categories no one else had names for. I think he did what he could, I said. Yes, Wolfe admitted. But he waited too long. The next day, Poirot mailed us a first edition of his book. The Archive Beneath the Estate, glossy cover, nervous prose, sanitized names. The inside flap mentioned thanks to anonymous consultants with unparalleled insight. I showed it to Wolfe. He didn't even open it. Have Fritz shelve it, he said, somewhere unoccupied. I flipped to the dedication. It read simply, "For those who remember what others bury," subtle and surprisingly accurate. We never spoke of it again. The tapes were gone, the file stored. The Moliners, as far as I knew, had scattered into quieter parts of the country. Gerda and Otto stayed on at the estate under the new owners, who were blissfully unaware of the ghosts still curled beneath the concrete floor. As for Wolfe and me, we resumed as we always did. He grumbled about imprecise newspaper language. I teased him about his waistline, and we both pretended not to remember the weight of the case we had carried. But some nights, when the street was quiet and the office was empty, I'd sit at my desk and take out the cellar key Everett had left behind. I never used it again, but I kept it in reach, not because I thought the cabinet would reopen, but because I knew some locks aren't meant to be turned, just held. That was Wolfe's world, and I chose to live in it. The end.